Chapter 14. As Original as Sin? The Reverend Cyrus Scofield, 1843 to 1921, was the sort of person who brings out the unconscious evil and woe in even the most unlikely of observers. For example, Scofield's wife obtained a legal separation in 1877, and they were eventually divorced in 1883. Scofield returned to St. Louis in 1879, where he drank heavily until he became a Christian later that year. That is from the Finding Aid to the Records of the Scofield Memorial Church in the archives of Dallas Theological Seminary. The observation is technically accurate, yet like most of the writing about Scofield and his work, it unavoidably wobbles when it comes to cause and effect. Scofield has collectively polarized his biographers, and that makes coming to terms with his greatest achievement difficult. In 1920, the New York branch of Oxford University Press published what was essentially a PR work for their most profitable author. Much of the material and most of the interpretation came directly from interviews with Scofield by the editor of the Sunday School Times, Charles Gallaudet Trumbull. The biography left out quite a bit that was negative and inflated the positive. There was a factually useful but markedly respectful M.A. thesis in 1960, and then in 1988, the pendulum swung the other way with a factually rich but very sour work by J.M. Canfield. The great majority of Canfield's research was confirmed by the 2009 work of David Lutzweiler, who also made clear that most of the misrepresentation of Scofield's life story in the original Trumbull biography had to have come from a lifetime of continual misrepresentation by Scofield himself. The most compelling work is actually an M.A. thesis, a splendid surprise. I have read hundreds of doctoral theses that are based on less research and without such inferential care in interpretation by D. Gene Rushing, 2011. My reading of the cumulative biographical material, for which I am very grateful, is that taken together, the historiography has a bent shape. Scofield left only a small amount of material that deals with his inner life. In contrast, the sheer accumulation of confirmed primary material from third-party sources that reflects his life details, the sort of thing evangelical biographies of his era religiously left out, is deeper and richer than we have for almost every comparable figure of his generation. That is a benison. Whatever one thinks of Scofield as a person, it was Scofield, the everyday human made from the mud of Eden, who was the final vector for transforming a system of belief that was originated by a small band of wealthy Anglo-Irish rentiers under fear of the rise of the Roman Catholics into a full-blown set of Scripture. By mid-20th century, the Scofield Reference Bible had become the regnant scriptures of evangelicals in North America. Scofield as a person confounds us, but as an apex vector in radical apocalyptic evangelicalism, he counts a great deal historically. We need to know things about him that he did not wish us to know. There are two ticks in the historiography that need quieting before dealing with Scofield directly. One of these is that, among students of Scofield, there exists something like a set of equations in Newtonian physics. Observers who affirm the value of Scofield's dispensational body of work are apt to downplay his conman side, and those who cannot fold dispensationalism are given to being excessively critical of Scofield's real-world behavior. There are not many individuals who affirm his theology while admitting to the full menu of his alleged misbehavior. Secondly, there is the dogleg distortion. This runs through most evangelical biographies. It is a staple that upon conversion, both the behavior and the personality of the individual changes. True converts are believed to have a new compass that diverts them sharply from their old trajectory. Indeed, in brethren-derived belief systems, it is an article of faith that every regenerate person has two natures, the one from Adam, received at birth, wholly bad, and a new nature received in a new birth, sharing the goodness of the Almighty. In the continuing life of the individual, these two natures are said to be in continual conflict. God's work, though, is done only by the new nature. Fair enough. It is a clear doctrine. What it obscures is that in the empirical world, it is possible for persons to be converted but not to change their basic pattern of behavior. They merely apply their old self to new, religiously sanctioned activities. Cyrus Scofield lived in royal times, and up to his evangelical conversion in 1879, he had a life that was interesting, in the Victorian, eyebrow-raised sense of that word. He quickly followed his conversion by becoming an evangelical laborer and then a congregational pastor, so he needed to deal decisively with his immediate past. Scofield had three alternatives. One was to purge his failing in a public confession, and to do so by giving a semi-public performance of laborious intimacies and voluptuous servilities, in a style that was common in the congregational world of the time. That is not the path he chose. Instead, he engaged in a partial confession, acknowledgement of sins that were on the list of usual vices, notably drunkenness. That was the utility sin of Gilded Age converts. Demon drink could be used to explain almost any deeply pathological behavior and to seal off conversation about things that everyone was uncomfortable talking about. For the rest of his life, Scofield either suppressed or directly denied multiple behaviors from his past that were not of the sort that a reformed soul-turned-pastor was supposed to have, much less discuss openly. To these misdirections, he later added a few claims of pre-conversion achievements that were solely of his own assertion. The point here is that, besides watching an interesting man navigate the tides of apocalyptic evangelicalism, we have an indication of the cast of mind of a person with the imagination and personal force required to build a new Bible. Specifically, some individual items that in a pointillist manner begin to form a picture. Born in 1843 into a Puritan-derived family, 1635 arrivals, that was engaged in timber and small farming in Michigan, the immediate family of 7 children was winnowed by disease to Cyrus and 4 older sisters. They became the nodal points of his pre-conversion life. In 1850, one of them, Emmeline, married Sylvester V. Papin, a Catholic from an old French fur-trading family who was city registrar of St. Louis, Missouri, and who proved very useful to Cyrus. Another sister, Laura, married a dentist and moved with him to Lebanon, Tennessee in 1858. A third sister, Victorine, joined them there. The fourth sister, Harriet, died in childbirth in 1856. With these human pieces in place, one sees Cyrus Scofield navigating through roiled times. In early 1861, having worked for a time in a Michigan sawmill, he moved to join his 2 sisters in Lebanon, Tennessee. There was a war on the horizon, but Cyrus apparently planned to attend Lebanon's Cumberland University, which had a full liberal arts curriculum and also one of the nation's leading law schools. In June 1861, the local county voted for secession. Scofield, though a Northerner, joined the local volunteers who formed the 7th Tennessee Infantry and engaged in what was supposed to be a 1-year enlistment. He served until his discharge in late September 1862. He was at Antietam Sharpsburg in mid-September 1862. At the same time, Scofield, realizing that Southern conscription laws had come into effect, was prosecuting a claim to the Confederate Secretary of War to be allowed discharge on the ground of bad health, of having been underage at enlistment, and of being an alien, a native of Michigan. Discharged, he made his way to St. Louis, where his sister Emmeline and her husband S.V. Papin provided lodging. More important, Papin, who was head of the Land and Title Registry in St. Louis, gave Scofield a clerkship and helped to keep him from the gaze of the federal authorities, who were skeptical concerning former Confederate soldiers. Scofield did well and was promoted to head clerk, and he still had time to study law. During the war, Scofield mixed in the social life of the higher end of French Catholic society in St. Louis, the families of Papin, Cyrus, and others who traced their line back to Auguste Chouteau, a fur trader of the 1760s. They were wealthy, and at this time had the prospect of receiving federal titles to a huge swath of empty land. In September 1866, Scofield married Leontine Cyrus. It was a civil ceremony, but she was a serious Catholic, and when daughters were born in 1867 and 1869, and a son in 1872, they each were christened by Leontine's priest, with Scofield family members participating. This marriage to a Catholic was scrubbed by Scofield from all public mention and from Trumbull's biography. Further, Scofield's participating in infant baptism, Romanist Catholic form, was beyond anything he ever could admit to the Niagara or Northfield evangelicals. Drunkenness, yes. Holding Congress with the whore of Babylon, no. As for the children, the son died as a toddler, and the two daughters were never given any public recognition of their existence by Scofield. For the moment, Scofield was on to an agreeable life and the possibility of some real wealth. His sister Laura from Tennessee and her dentist husband moved to St. Louis, as did the third sister, Victorine, who married a St. Louis man. Scofield had a close family circle of his own sisters and spouses, a wife and children, and a support network in the financial world that centered on his wife's French Catholic relations. Scofield's brother-in-law and mentor and his own wife were second cousins, and were among the heirs of a French ancestor who in 1802 had obtained a massive grant of land from the then Spanish authorities in what became Missouri and Kansas. These lands had been taken by Anglo settlers, but the federal government of the United States provided a grant of 38,000 acres of allegedly empty land in Kansas as compensation. Scofield, who already had, by courtesy, tried cases in St. Louis, was sent to Atchison, Kansas, to look after the Papin family interests. He was admitted to the Kansas bar in 1869. In late 1870, his benefactor and brother-in-law, S.V. Papin, died, leaving Scofield's sister as sole heir to that part of the big land grant, and his own wife as one of the other heirs. Scofield was 27 years of age, holding a law license and brokering land transactions, and he had a wife from a wealthy family. He was playing with house money, a rising man. In 1871, he was elected as a Republican to the Kansas House of Representatives and served as chair of the Judiciary Committee. In June 1873, he took up a presidential appointment by Ulysses S. Grant as U.S. Attorney for the Kansas District, a major step towards a national judicial or political career. All Scofield had to do to access a splendid future was either to be manifestly honest or skillfully dishonest. He was neither. In December 1873, 6 months into a 2-year term, he resigned his federal post. He was involved in judicial corruption that stemmed from alleged vote buying in the January 1873 Kansas senatorial election for an open seat. This was not a popular vote election. Under the rules of the time, the selection of the senator was by a joint session of the Kansas House and Senate. The main losing candidate was directly charged with bribery, and an investigation was launched by the local district attorney for Topeka, Kansas. This was after Scofield took up his appointment for the federal jurisdiction, and the matter moved up to his desk. Scofield quashed the investigation, and very quickly thereafter, the Chicago Tribune obtained affidavits that showed that the accused candidate had paid Scofield $1,000. Under public scrutiny, he resigned in disgrace, but avoided prosecution. In his later career, and in the Trumbull biography, the 1873 election was discussed by Scofield, but the sale of justice was erased, and his humiliating demitting of office simply never happened. All downhill. Scofield left Atchison, Kansas, with a trail of local debts. He and his family returned to St. Louis to live with his sister, the widow Emmeline. There, their toddler son died, and he was buried with the French relatives. Scofield, from early 1874 until 1877, tried to establish a successful law practice, but failed. He was falling apart and failing to provide support for his family. The couple separated in 1877, and Leontine and his children moved back to Atchison, where her mother had a house. Scofield left St. Louis in mid-1877, when a criminal complaint was filed over a promissory note on which he allegedly has signed his sister's name. He cleared off, and in the autumn of 1877 was working a confidence scheme as Charles Ingerson, acting as the owner of a 1,300-acre southern plantation and courting a young Milwaukee woman, presumably for her money. A little over a year later, once again operating under an alias, this time as Cyrus Ingerson, a choice that does not speak creativity, he was arrested in Horicon, Wisconsin, and sent back to St. Louis, where his forgery charge still was pending. Between various collisions with the justice system, he spent a good portion of 1878 in custody. Dispiriting to read as they are, these detached items of information, like the points on a spatter diagram, provide a pattern that will help to identify sub-patterns of either commonality or of contrast when one reflects on the two periods of Cyrus I. Scofield's career, pre- and post-conversion. The primary variable here is Scofield's behaviors over time. Did these change greatly, somewhat, or not really at all, as indicia of his ethics and level of ambition? There is, however, one complicating background matter. It is fully possible that in the United States in Scofield's era, the ethical and behavioral requirements for a frontier lawyer, and in distinction, a successful urban pastor, were markedly different. Put bluntly, any obvious moderation in Scofield's behavior could, in part, be a reflection of the lesser ethical and legal restraints applicable to pastors as compared to lawyers. American law of Scofield's era attempted to control attorneys quite tightly, but legislators intervened in religious matters with the greatest reluctance, which is to say, if Scofield does quickly become a notably different person, the causal variable could, again in part, simply be his change of career. For the moment, we should outline Scofield's career line and outward behavior, and save for later discussion the really big issue, the nature of the undeniable but strangely flat-toned and laconic religious genius he possessed, and through which he produced a new version of the Scriptures. Scofield's conversion in September 1879, at the nadir of his life, is not controversial. The story he preferred was that Thomas S. McPheeters, a friend a bit younger than Scofield's own age, mid-30s, called on him at his law office and, after some conversation, demanded, "Why are you not a Christian?" Scofield's remembered response was, "Does not the Bible say something about drunkards having no place in heaven? I am a hard drinker, McPheeters." The dialogue continued, with the result that the two men dropped to their knees, and Scofield accepted Christ as his Savior. Scofield was amazingly swift off the mark in painting himself into a religious career. Almost instantly, he made connections and acquired patrons. Before the end of December 1879, he was working with the St. Louis YMCA, and soon was on to Dwight L. Moody's 6-month revival campaign in that city. These activities related to Moody's campaign in the months of late November 1879 to April 1880. And not incidentally, Moody in early 1879 had been elected national president of the YMCA. These were unpaid jobs for Scofield. He was living in a single room and had no reliable source of income. But even this degree of confidence by Moody in a new convert was remarkable. Granted, when he cleaned up, a former lawyer who had once been a federal U.S. attorney was a good addition both to the YMCA and to the revival. That noted, one infers that the real source of Scofield's quick entry into the evangelical workforce was the connection with Thomas McPheeters, his first spiritual guide. McPheeters' father, one of the main figures in Southern Presbyterianism, was a close co-worker with James Hall Brooks. They had stood together, calling for formal neutrality by their church during the Civil War and against ecclesiastical condemnations of slavery. Swiftly, therefore, Scofield became well-connected. Brooks tutored Scofield over 2.5 years, and given that Scofield was virtually a blank sheet as far as religious knowledge was concerned, the new convert acquired proto-dispensationalism from one of its chief American conduits. At a pastoral level, Scofield was taught by the Reverend C. L. Goodell of St. Louis's Pilgrim Congregational Church, and was also one of the main figures in that city's YMCA. Scofield did not need any tutoring in general public speaking. He had been a state legislator. But under Goodell's supervision, he practiced giving talks to church groups and the more difficult skill of cold audience evangelicalism. In this case, work among railway workers. In August 1880, Scofield became acting secretary of the St. Louis YMCA, and in the same year was given a limited, local preaching license by the St. Louis Association of Congregational Churches. He started his own Hyde Park Congregational Church. This embryonic career was interrupted in June to July 1881 when newspapers in Atchison and in Topeka reported that Leontine Scofield was filing for divorce. She charged that her husband had abandoned her and their children. She was quoted as saying that, "I will gladly give him the matrimonial liberty he desires," a double entendre that perhaps implies that she believed Scofield not only wanted shut of his marriage, but had seeding other pastures in mind. The divorce suit wound on for 2 more years. Given the place in St. Louis society of Mrs. Scofield's in-laws and the notoriety of Scofield's dismissal as the U.S. Attorney for Kansas, Congregational church authorities in St. Louis could not let matters quietly slip by, and in July 1882 they withdrew his preaching license. Scofield's religious career was spared being derailed when he soon was talent spotted by congregational authorities who needed a pastor on a trial basis for a mission church in Dallas, Texas. Mission here meaning that the congregation was not yet self-supporting. Scofield quickly accepted the post, and by mid-August he was in Dallas, taking up a fellowship of fewer than 30 adult members. He did well. The assembly grew, and as a preliminary to holding the pulpit on a regular basis, Scofield petitioned the St. Louis authorities for a reinstatement of his preaching license. In April 1883, it was granted by a split vote, 23-6. That was good enough for the mission church. He was affirmed as the regular pastor and ordained the 17th of October, 1883, for service in the First Congregational Church of Dallas. Thus began one of the famous pastorates in 19th century American evangelicalism, running uninterrupted to 1895 or 96, and episodically thereafter. Yet, at the start, Scofield cut things very close indeed. As mentioned before, he was ordained on the 17th of October, 1883. The dates here are not false precision, they count. The divorce case against Scofield was winding through the courts, and on the 8th of December, 1883, a final decree was handed down, dissolving the marriage and prohibiting Scofield from having anything to do with the upbringing of the two now teenage daughters. On the 9th of December, 1883, two sisters, originally from Michigan, Hetty and Mattie Van Wartz, were formally granted membership in Scofield's church in Dallas. How long they had been in the fellowship previously is unknown, as is anything significant about the backstory. In any case, Scofield married Hetty on the 11th of March, 1884. Scofield thus was ordained, held a full pastorate with a regular stipend, and had a respectable Protestant evangelical marriage. For the rest of his life, he erased his earlier marriage and family from any public mention, and provided them with no support. Scofield's run as a Dallas pastor was distinguished by his doing very well those things that a top-level evangelical minister was expected to do. He set the fellowship on its own financial feet, and did so only by accepting money from believers, no bazaars or sales of work to the wider world, for only the children of God could further the kingdom of God. He conducted satisfying Sunday services and weekday prayer meetings and study sessions. His church had a recognized missionary profile. In 1890, Scofield was the founding president of the Central American Mission that concentrated on Latin America, south of Mexico. This was a faith mission in the classic Brethren model. No salaries were paid, and neither missionaries nor its home supporters directly solicited funds. If the mission was pure, money simply arrived. As home front outreach, Scofield became head in 1892 of an evanescent institution called the Southwestern School of the Bible. Although it never was on the formal list of requirements for an evangelical clergyman, it was at least hoped that in his public profile he would make his congregation proud. Scofield did this well, and in so doing served both his people and himself. A good example was his transformation from a Northern interloper into a Confederate comrade, and even a hero. Scofield, in his early years in Dallas, kept quiet about his dual allegiance during the Civil War, but in what appears to be honest coincidence, he was encountered in late 1887 by Dr. H.M. Manson, the editor of a newspaper in Rockwell, Texas, near Dallas. Manson had served in the 7th Tennessee and recognized his old Army friend. He wrote a piece, a noble tribute to a soldier turned man of God. The story was picked up by the Dallas Morning News. Thus Scofield overcame his northern roots, being, in essence, culturally naturalized as far as Dallas was concerned. Little by little, the people of Dallas came to learn that the new pastor of the Yankee Church was a Confederate soldier. That gave him social standing. This standing he augmented by his engaging in the articulation and celebration of the lost cause mythology. When the United Confederate Veterans were established in 1889, he became an honored speaker at the Dallas camp and later elsewhere. These activities put him in line with the moneyed class in Dallas and significantly helped his church. Scofield's dexterity in reforming historical evidence to fit his personal preferences was well exhibited when in 1900 the United Daughters of the Confederacy began issuing medals. The Southern Cross of Honor was not a military medal in any direct sense. Scofield had given a number of speeches for the Dallas chapter, and he was honored on Memorial Day 1904 with the Daughters Medal. No citation, just that he had been a private in the 7th Tennessee Infantry. Scofield took to declaring that he had been given a medal for bravery at Antietam, Sharpsburg. The 1912 edition of Who's Who in America, based on self-provided information, stated concerning Scofield, Private, Company H, 7th Tennessee Infantry, May 1861 to close of Civil War. Served in Army of Northern Virginia under General Lee, and awarded Cross of Honor for valor at Battle of Antietam. Clearly, Scofield had a good war. Similarly, association with Dwight L. Moody was a relationship that told his congregation, and indeed the entire Dallas community, that the Reverend Mr. Scofield was in touch with the top echelon of American evangelicalism. Moody preached a 3-day revival at a Dallas roller skating rink in early March 1886, and returned briefly in February 1895 on the way to a major mission in Mexico. Scofield featured well in these events. More important for his status within the emerging dispensationalist sphere, he began attending the Northern Summer Conferences at Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, and Northfield, Massachusetts. His pattern, developed from 1886 onward, was to take a 3-month sabbatical with his wife and mix the conference circuit with a long vacation. Scofield did not have the stamina of Dwight L. Moody, few did, and he needed rest and recuperation each year. Niagara, presided over by his mentor James H. Brooks, was the entry point into the top tier. Scofield gave his first paper in 1887 on the Holy Spirit and the Gifts of Service, and the next year he provided a tight exposition on rightly dividing the word of truth that in various editions became one of the main building blocks of his work on the epical The Scofield Reference Bible. Clearly, Scofield made more than a small impact when, as discussed in Chapter 12, the management of the Niagara Conference was reorganized in 1889. He was on the new board. As we have heard earlier, the Niagara Conferences were the central corridor for defining and dissemination of the dominant strain of dispensational apocalypticism in North America. Admission to the Northfield Circle came somewhat more slowly, but by 1896 he was a pillar, providing 2 papers that were later published in Northfield Echoes. Still, Scofield required more recognition. In the 1890s, one finds him referring to himself as D.D., Doctor of Divinity. This was not unusual for a leading clergyman, except that it was self-bestowed. The D.D. had high status as an honor, and was automatically attached to certain offices in the Anglican, Catholic, and Presbyterian denominations. It was also awarded as an honorary degree to major scholars by top-quality universities. In the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as ad hoc evangelical institutions emerged, they frequently recognized famous preachers and large donors with a D.D., and in so doing gained some publicity for themselves. The one rule was that the degree had to come from someplace. It was not to be printed on self-made parchment. No one has yet discovered any institutional record that claims to be the source of Scofield's degree, He never indicated where he allegedly received the degree, and in circumstances where his claiming it might have led to investigation, such as his Who's Who entry, he cannily did not claim the distinction. Whether or not C.I. Scofield, the fast-tracking pastor from Dallas, was the same soul who had been an unsuccessful Mid-American confidence man is a difficult question to answer.